The Vikings, those supposed untamable barbarians, were never what we were taught. A lonely English monastery blazes under a black sky, but there are no bearded warriors in horned helmets storming the cloister. Instead, plain-looking merchants in fine clothes bargain calmly with a bishop who hands over manuscripts for silver coins. On the shoreline, longships wait not for a massacre, but for a carefully arranged exchange. A local Saxon lord watches from the shadows, counting his cut. The Vikings were not the bloodthirsty savages of our films. They were shrewd entrepreneurs in a medieval world of opportunity. The story you learned is an elaborate lie woven by those who wrote the records we still treat as truth. You felt that opening as a jolt. It is not the sequence schools show you. Now, before we unpack the evidence, let's recall the tidy story most people still learn. The official myth arrives polished and loud. It is the version that fills classrooms, museum plaques, and primetime documentaries. Vikings as cinematic invaders, driven only by bloodlust. Picture drakkars slicing foggy water. Picture warriors with wild hair, painted faces, horns on helmets, descending like a force of nature to rake the coast. Picture monasteries set alight, monks slaughtered, relics stolen. That image has power because it is simple. It gives a villain everyone can name and a lesson everyone can accept. Civilization is fragile. Faith must be defended. In the neat school narrative, the era begins with Lindisfarne in 793. That attack becomes a symbol, a single moment in which Europe supposedly woke up to a new horror. For decades, the story reads like a morality play. Pagans versus Christians, chaos versus order. The Vikings are the other, useful, then, to every institution that needs a boogeyman. It is a comfortable story. It tells you who to fear and who to trust. It also erases inconvenient complexities. Listen to the voices of the myth as if they were quotations from films and textbooks. One historian voice says, "From the north came a storm. The monasteries fell and the dark age deepened." A sermon voice intones, "God's house was profaned by heathen men. Only the faithful will endure." A schoolbook voice assures, "Eventually they were Christianized and folded into Europe's story." These phrases ring confident and whole. They are circular. Crisis produces response. Response produces order. Why is this tidy account held so tightly? Because it serves many masters. It justifies the expansion of power kings and churchmen who promised protection in exchange for obedience. It supplies a moral geometry that paints conquest and consolidation as the cure for chaos. It simplifies diplomatic, economic, and legal shifts into a single narrative of salvation and victory. The official account also hides a basic contradiction. How do savages build trade routes to Byzantium and produce legal assemblies that anticipate parliamentary thought? If you accept the simple story, these facts stick out like nails. Yet textbooks often ignore those nails. Instead, the myth doubles down on spectacle, fire, blood, the urgency of defending the faithful. Imagine 3 frames of a classic documentary montage to feel the comfort of the version you know. Frame 1. A painted map, red arrows flashing from Scandinavia to England, Ireland, Francia. Frame 2. A dramatic reenactment of a coastal raid, slow-motion shields and shouts. Frame 3. A portrait of a Christian king blessing troops, the implied moral arc complete. The montage satisfies. It closes the question. Who benefits from that closure? Empires and institutions. For a church that preached divine order, framing the Vikings as demonic invaders justified increased tithes, fortified monasteries, and intensified clerical control. For emerging monarchs, the Viking threat legitimated the centralization of military power and the creation of new judicial mechanisms. For later nationalists, the myth offered ancestry and stark moral lines to draw between us and them. And for the modern entertainment industry, the Viking image is instantly marketable. Strong visuals, dramatic stakes, simple moral contrasts. That is the official script. It is clean, repeatable, and profitable. It answers questions the medieval world asked about itself. But good myths are rarely neutral. They answer for some interests and silence others. There is an entire dossier of evidence that the tidy story ignores, downplays, or reframes. And that omission is not always accidental. Before we move on, listen to two short sample lines that capture the official tone, the voices you have heard, and that comforted generations. They came in the night with the sea at their backs and fire in their hands. They were pagans, wild and unclean, an affront to God's order. Hear their certainty. Hear their refusal to linger over nuance. Now, a word from the channel. Thank you for following this investigation so far. This channel is small and hungry for truth. If you've stayed this long, consider subscribing. We aim for 1,000 supporters so we can keep digging into histories the schoolbook skipped. Your subscription helps sustain research, translations, and the kind of episodes that make institutions squirm. The tidy picture has to be dismantled carefully. That means we open the archives, compare sources, and set evidence against narrative until the seams show. We will do that now, not to romanticize the Vikings and not to whitewash violence, but to show what the historical record actually contains and who edited that record to serve a story. The first crack in the myth is visual and nearly ubiquitous: the horned helmet. The image is so stubborn it becomes a test case for the gap between myth and evidence. Archaeology has yielded many helmets from Viking Age contexts. Not one of them has horns. The horned helmet is a 19th century theatrical invention, popularized by Wagnerian stagings and solidified by mass culture. That false image says more about Romantic-era Europe than it says about Scandinavia in the 9th century. Yet the false image stuck because it was photogenic. It turned the Viking into a caricature rather than a people. Moving beyond costumes, the next fissure is textual. The primary chronicles we rely on are overwhelmingly written by clerics, the supposed victims. These writers had motives. They needed to explain trauma, to locate meaning in calamity, and to rally resources. Their accounts often deploy apocalyptic language, mixing eyewitness with moralizing imagery. If your only sources for a culture are its enemies, you will get a one-sided portrait. That imbalance matters. It affects not only depiction but the scale of events. Many chroniclers used rhetorical devices to magnify horror. A raid that took dozens of lives might be recorded as countless slain or a river of blood. Without countervailing sources, these descriptions calcify into facts. Modern historians must therefore parse language from context. They look for corroboration: coins, mass graves, ship remnants, administrative records. Archaeology complicates the simple story in multiple ways. Excavated settlements in Scandinavia from the Viking Age show planned farmsteads, high-quality crafts, and durable architecture. Trade goods in Scandinavian graves include Islamic silver dirhams, Byzantine silks, and Mediterranean glass. These finds suggest far-reaching commerce, not isolated marauding bands. Ships were technological marvels, not primitive skiffs. Their design enabled both trade and warfare. The mobility the Scandinavians had could be deployed for many ends. The chronology of interaction also undermines the sudden onslaught narrative. By the late 8th century, Norse traders and seasonal migrants had long-standing ties to the British Isles and the continent. Urban centers such as Dublin and York emerged from complex processes of trade, settlement, and hybrid governance, not simply conquest. The Vikings did not appear out of nowhere. They adapted and absorbed. When they settled, they often blended with local societies, contributing to economy and law. One clear example: in parts of northern England, legal practices under Norse influence, including assemblies and public law codes, proved attractive to locals who had experienced the capriciousness of feudal lordship. The Thing, a Norse assembly, offered transparency and participation that contrasted with arbitrary seigneurial justice. That legal appeal explains part of why traders, mercenaries, and disgruntled local elites supplied information. Clerical figures sometimes colluded with outsiders when factional struggles within kingdoms made such alliances expedient. It is a pattern that recasts the so-called invasion as often a form of political intervention within existing disputes. Now imagine the reaction in the corridors of power. Churchmen terrified of losing patronage and lands, local lords alarmed about tax bases, kings eager to centralize authority. Each had reason to amplify the threat and to present the Vikings as an existential danger. Thus, a feedback loop formed. Raids happened. Elites exaggerated the danger. Militarization and narrative control followed. That loop is the engine of propaganda. Chroniclers wrote from a perspective that favored a strong church and strong kings. Their texts were pedagogical as much as factual. When literacy was concentrated in monastic centers, the written record necessarily reflects their priorities. There are further contradictions that pull at the myth. Consider technological mastery. Norse shipbuilding was advanced, with clinker-built hulls and sail rigs that allowed remarkable speed and maneuverability. Their metallurgy produced superior swords admired across Europe. The cultural products rune stones, artistic metalwork, ship burials display a high degree of aesthetic sophistication. These elements do not align with a picture of backward savagery. When the Vikings settled and established urban centers, those towns often became vibrant trade hubs. Dublin, for example, crystallized as an entrepot for commerce between the Irish hinterland and the North Sea network. York developed as a major trading node. These urban forms contradict the roving bandit image. They suggest entrepreneurship, administration, and innovation. Let us return to Lindisfarne, the emblematic opening salvo. It was undeniably violent and traumatic. But placed in context, the attack looks less like the start of an unstoppable barbarian wave and more like a targeted operation aimed at wealth and political effect. The monastery was a storehouse and an anchor of local aristocratic power. Destroying it served multiple interests: economic plunder, undermining a rival faction, and signaling control. Most importantly, the historical record shows that Vikings took captives selectively. Those with skilled scribes, metalworkers, administrators were valuable. That implies an understanding of human capital. Captives were assets. Such behavior fits a pragmatic logic. By now the pattern becomes clear. The image of Vikings as mindless destroyers is a partial truth grafted over a broader reality. Violence was real. Cultural exchange was real. Commerce was central. Governance and law evolved. The two images, savage and sophisticated, coexisted. The problem is that one image was amplified so consistently for so long that it overwhelmed the other. But why did the image persist beyond the Middle Ages? The answer leads to later reinterpretations. As Scandinavian kingdoms Christianized and consolidated power, elites in those regions had incentives to distance themselves from a marauding past. They participated in rewriting memory, framing the era as a dark stage replaced by the redemption of conversion. In Western Europe, the Church retained incentives to present the period as a series of miraculous or punitive events confirming divine order. In the 19th century, Romanticism and nascent nationalism repackaged the Vikings yet again, sometimes as noble savages, sometimes as progenitors of a mythic national past, depending on political aim. Finally, modern entertainment seized the image. Film, television, and games prefer a single, dramatic archetype. The horned helmet Viking is cheap shorthand. Costumes sell. Battles thrill. Nuance is boring to mass markets. So the image perpetuates. This is the official myth's life cycle: medieval alarm, institutional interest, selective recording, later nationalistic rebranding, contemporary entertainment commodification. Each stage polishes the myth further. We have peeled back the first layers. The official story remains useful to many actors. But underneath is a messier, richer history of trade, law, settlement, gender roles, technological innovation, and political complexity. That history is harder to narrate, but far more illuminating. And those are the scenes we will keep opening document by document, shard by shard, deposit by deposit in the chapters that follow. Mini cliffhanger. If the churchman wrote the story and the kings endorsed it, who read it afterward, and what did the readers do with the simpler version? The answer moves us toward the next set of fissures. The awkward presences in archives, the silences where whole communities vanish from the record, and the numbers that do not add up. Stay with me. The cracks get louder. The first fissure is visual, the helmet. It is almost trivial, yet it is revealing. Museums and textbooks parade horned helmets as if they were archaeological facts. They are not. No authenticated Viking Age helmet with horns has ever been found. The horned image stems from 19th century theatricality opera, romantic imagination, and from the desire to make an enemy look exotic and terrifying. That the image persists tells us something important. Myths prefer the dramatic over the accurate. But that discovery is only an entree. The next, deeper crack appears in the sources themselves. Ask where the stories come from, and you will find clerical pens. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Irish Annals, monastery letters, these are our primary narratives. They were written by monks whose worldview shaped every line. These writers were literate, institutional, and often politically entangled. They wrote to sustain patronage, to explain losses, to exhort the faithful, to secure donations for walls and churches. Their prose is pedagogic as much as documentary. Imagine an archivist in a stone chamber. A scribe hands a parchment to the abbot. The abbot reads aloud. An unclean horde from the north came by stealth. He stamps the parchment with theological gloss. Sin, punishment, and instruction. The narrative crystallizes. It travels. Others copy it. Over generations, a pattern hardens. Raids equal divine judgment. Enemies equal devils. The repetitive rhetoric makes the exception into a rule. Yet when historians look beyond the rhetoric, details conflict. Accounts date events differently. Numbers balloon. Locations blur. The record shows not a steady crescendo of northern brutality, but a patchwork of interactions. Trade missions, occasional plunder, seasonal overwintering, and, at times, deeper settlements. The textual record is vital, but it is partial in the extreme. Turn to chronology. The start of the Viking Age at Lindisfarne, 793, is more symbolic than absolute. Scandinavian contact with the British Isles predates that date in many forms. Exchange, migration, gift exchange. Men traveled for marriage, for trade, for temporary settlement long before that dramatic raid. The so-called explosion is a shift in patterns and methods, not the sudden arrival of a new species of human. That nuance is crucial. It makes clear that the Vikings were participants in a changing medieval economy, not aliens invading a passive Europe. Archaeology intensifies the contradiction. Graves, hordes, settlement patterns, and imported goods tell a different story. Silver from Abbasid hordes appears in Scandinavian graves. Islamic coins show up far north of the Mediterranean. Byzantine cloisonne shows up in tombs. These items prove networks durable, reciprocal, and lucrative. People who maintained those networks invested in ships and ports. They had skills in metallurgy and navigation. That is the opposite of uncivilized. Consider urban traces. Viking-founded centers like Dublin or Jorvik, York, evolved into real urban organisms. Marketplaces, craftspeople, administrative nodes. They minted coins, regulated trade, and adjudicated disputes. Urban life implies needs. Warehouses, long-term trade relations, bureaucratic functions. Such complexity is hardly compatible with the image of chaotic raiders living only by the sword. Another fissure is legal preference. Why did some communities prefer Norse legal structures? The thing, an assembly offered participation and predictability. Under feudal systems, justice often depended on the whim of a lord. Under chroniclers used literary devices, hyperbole, biblical analogies, rhetorical enumeration to make events morally legible. A raid described as the slaughter of all may, under archaeological scrutiny, correspond to a localized massacre or a successful plundering of movable wealth. Scholars therefore read texts against grain, searching for corroboration in material remains and fiscal records. Now, follow the trail of absences. Who is missing from the chronicles? Women, for the most part, are silent in these sources unless depicted in extremes. But archaeology shows women in Viking societies with property rights, with roles in trade and craft. Old Norse law gave women more legal rights than many contemporary societies. Landholding, divorce options, and inheritance were possible. Why do medieval monastic writers, steeped in a patriarchal church environment, either ignore these realities or depict them as signs of licentiousness? The silence is telling. Linguistic evidence creates fissures too. Place names across Britain and Ireland contain Norse elements. By, Thorpe, Garth. These names are markers of settlement and integration. DNA studies in island populations show genetic admixture consistent with Norse settlement, not merely transient raiding. When living memory is buried in the soil and in place names, it suggests long-term social integration, not ephemeral plunder. Consider also the technological paradox. If Vikings were technologically backward, how did their ships outpace many contemporaries? The longship was an engineering breakthrough. Shallow draft for river travel, symmetrical ends for rapid beaching, and flexible speed under or sail. Such technical superiority enabled both surprise raids and long-distance trade. Moreover, metalworking in Scandinavia reached high levels. Fine blades, intricate silverwork, and complex jewelry testify to skilled craftsmen. The narrative of barbarism cannot accommodate such sophistication. Economic logic is another fissure. Why seize manuscripts, silver, and skilled labor? Because these are tradable assets. Monasteries contained literacy and administration. Seizing scribes meant gaining knowledge and utility. Capturing metalworkers or shipwrights supplied skills to the captors. These actions align with an economic orientation. Acquire capital, human, and material to enhance your group's standing. Violence here is instrumental. One of the most disturbing fissures is how the church turned the image of Vikings into a spiritual moral drama. Monasteries framed raids as divine punishment for sin. The frame worked. Fear motivates donations. Sermons used Vikings as moral parables, urging piety and obedience. The church's rhetorical machinery amplified trauma into a theological narrative that justified institutional expansion: more walls, more endowments, more clerical oversight. Over centuries, the rhetorical echo made a contingent historical episode into an epical moral crisis. Next, look at reinterpretation and reuse. By the time the Scandinavian kingdoms consolidated and Christianized themselves, they began to recast the Viking past. Local elites in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden had incentive to downplay episodes that made their ancestors look criminal. They participated in creating a different memory, transformation through conversion, continuity of noble lineage. Memory politics is not unique to one side. Winners and assimilated groups everywhere rewrite the past to suit present needs. The 19th century reimagined Vikings again. Nationalists in Norway and Germany used Viking imagery to construct a heroic past. In other contexts, the Viking was a symbol of European vigor and racial mythology. Romantic literature sanitized and exalted the noble savage image, or inverted it to cast Vikings as precursors to modern nationhood. This selective remembering continued to the modern era, when film and television commodified the myth into a marketable iconography. So what do these cracks add up to? They do not exonerate all Viking behavior. Violence, kidnapping, and brutality occurred. Lives were taken, communities traumatized. But the pattern is not a single, unambiguous phenomenon of savage invasion. It is a set of overlapping strategies: trade, settlement, political intervention, opportunistic raiding, and cultural exchange. The historical picture is complex and often awkward for those who prefer clear villains. We must therefore read sources critically, triangulate with archaeological data, and keep ideological motives in view. That is the historian's craft, not to erase violence, but to contextualize it, to understand motivation, and to expose how narrative power reshapes memory. Mini cliffhanger. The more we look, the more the comfortable moral lines blur. The people we were taught to call barbarians were actors in a world of economic incentives, legal innovation, and political opportunity. When you take away the horned helmets and the rhetorical adjectives, you are left with a society that challenges modern categories of civilized and barbaric. Up ahead, we will follow how those categories were weaponized and how they continue to shape our politics and pop culture. Behind the battles and the headlines, there was a quieter, more ordinary world, and that world rewrites everything you think you know about the Northmen. Picture a timber farm at dawn, mist clinging to low stone walls, a dog's bark, the lowing of cattle. Men in wool and leather turn over soil by hand. Women tend hearths, men nets, haggle at market stalls. Children chase chickens. This is the scene that built the ships that later thrummed across the North Sea. These are the people who paid the crews, trained the smiths, and kept the books. You learned Vikings as warriors. The records taught you that. But archaeology, the shards in the ground, the pattern of hearths and field walls says something else. Most people at the fringes of Scandinavia were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen. Their villages show planning and investment. Longhouses stand on prepared foundations. Storage pits and barns speak of planned harvests and shared risks. That matters because it collapses the cartoon. Raids are not the life. Raids are a strategy, one part of a mixed economy that includes trade, craft, and agriculture. The daily life of ordinary Norse people had striking differences from contemporary Christian polities. Women not caricatured as passive in any honest source beyond hostile sermons held legal rights that surprised medieval Europeans. Women could own and manage property. They could initiate divorce under the laws preserved in later sagas and legal codes. They inherited land. They guaranteed lineage. A woman in a Norse farm could run a household, a trading post, or, in rare cases, a voyage. In documentary terms, this is a consensus view. Law codes and later legal tradition confirm that women's rights were not fantasies. Contrast that with sermon literature that sought to use female agency as evidence of moral decay. The contrast is deliberate. It is propaganda in miniature. Now shift to the ateliers, the smithies, and the docks. Close your eyes and listen. The ring of a hammer on anvil. The hiss of water on fresh steamed oak, the call of a foreman measuring a keel. Vinland or Byzantium, the destination does not matter. What matters is the supply chain that feeds into those trips. A single raid requires more than weapons. It requires carpenters, rope makers, sail makers, metal workers. Capturing skilled people, scribes, metal workers, shipwrights was not random cruelty. It was investment. The spoils of war included knowledge and labor. That is a fact the chroniclers rarely accentuate because it complicates their moral script. Captives were assets, not merely victims. Trade was the engine. Silver hoards from the Abbasid world show up in graves far north of the Baltic. Silk threads from Byzantium appear in burial cloths. These are not curiosities. They are evidence of networks. Traders needed ports, taxes, negotiating partners. Towns like Ribe, Birka, Hedeby, archaeological layers thick with foreign goods, are not military camps. They are commercial nodes, with warehouses and regulations. The presence of coinage, weights, and standardized measures implies laws and a trust system. Ships were the high-capacity trucks of the age. They carried pelts, salted fish, slaves, and luxury goods. That breathes reality into the fray. Local elites, including some clerics, had interests that sometimes aligned with Viking actors. You might imagine a monk, disgruntled over a local count's seizure of tithes, passing a discreet note to a trader. The Norse then showed up at the precise cove at low tide. It's pragmatic, not poetic, and it exposes how many early raids were predicated on local knowledge and fractures. Now consider migration and settlement with an eye to gradualism. People did not invade and vanish into a different species. Norse settlers mixed, married, and negotiated. Place names and burial rites become documents in stone and soil. By Thorpe, Garth. Genetics records admixture. The material culture beads, combs, brooches shows hybridity. In Normandy, the Norse quickly adapted the language and feudal structures. Within a few generations, descendants ruled as dukes speaking French, sponsoring abbeys and crusades. That assimilation is not an erasure of identity, but a mechanism of survival and political opportunity. This quieter world was not benign. There were violent episodes and ruthless entrepreneurs. But violence had a logic, economic incentive, political advantage, or retribution. The capture of skilled persons, the seizing of silver, and the strategic destruction of fortresses were rational choices. When you shift the frame from moral panic to economic structure, raids are not mysteries of savagery. They are levers of mobility in a competitive landscape. Still, this complexity unsettles the tidy stories you were taught. It demands a recalibration. If most Norse people were farmers, if women held rights, if law and market formed stable alternatives to feudal violence, then the simple story of barbarians crashing through history is bankrupt. And because it undermines established, comforting narratives, the church as protector, monarchy as deliverer, powerful institutions had reasons to flatten complexity into caricature. That flattening is not an accident. It is an act of narrative control. Listen closely. The real rupture between the everyday Norse and the Viking image is not only in who they were, but in who wrote about them. The chroniclers had agendas. They needed victims, villains, sins, and miracles. When you read a pious man write of heat like hell and a tide of slaughter, ask whose story he is telling and why. The quiet scenes from the farms to the markets, the ones I've been sketching, are the evidence that the dominant medieval narrative buried deliberately. The next piece of the puzzle is not in the fields but in the fortress, and there, the stakes turned imperial. Stay with me. A targeted attack at a holy center would change not just a coast, but an entire story. Tension had been thick in the air of Northumbria. Imagine a coastal monastery at dawn. Gulls rise over reed beds, bells still half asleep at the priory, monks moving between cloisters with fish-scented sandals and ink-smudged fingers. The abbey was not an isolated sensibility. It functioned like a bank, a granary, and a court. Ledgers recorded rents. Relics attracted pilgrims and patronage. The place was a local hub of power as much as a place of prayer. That is the key. Lindisfarne, the canonical start of the Viking Age, was a symbol and a storehouse. When the raiders arrived, they were not spilling over the map like a natural disaster. They were executing a precision operation. Ships run up the sand flat at dawn. Men disembark, not in a frenzy but in method. Locks of chests are broken. Precious books and silver are assembled. Skilled captives, scribes who could copy, metalworkers who could repair arms, administrators who could tally plunder are separated from the general population. The rest of the monastic community is a problem to be managed. Some are ransomed, others die. The chroniclers, unsurprisingly, captured the drama with biblical fury. But the object of the attack was clear: wealth, knowledge, and leverage. You have an image of the attack replayed in textbooks as pure horror. Now look at immediate context. Northumbria's internal politics were roiling. Noble feuds, disputed kingships, and competing patrons undermined centralized defense. Monasteries had become extensions of aristocratic control. They collected rents and political influence. A rival noble, eager to erode a faction's power, had incentives to cultivate outside pressure. There are later testimonies, ambiguous but suggestive, that alliances and secret agreements made the raiders more than just external predators. They became tools in internal contests. If you are thinking this sounds like outsourcing violence to weaken a rival, you are right on the thread historians have been pulling for decades. The assault on Lindisfarne did ripple outward. For the Church, the attack threatened not only treasure but narrative authority. If God's house could be violated so simply, what room remained for divine protection as a guarantor of order? Monasteries had long sold the promise of sanctuary. Now that sale faltered. Clerical writers wrote in apocalyptic language because that rhetoric mobilized, and it secured resources. Pulpits filled with fear convert to increased donations and reinforced dependency. Walls were built, tithe systems tightened. The image of chaos breeding the need for institutional control is the same story told across ages. Yet it is critical to measure intentions and outcomes separately. Did these Norse raiders hate Christianity as a creed? Not consistently. In other cases, they targeted centers with no political tie or took care to avoid those with ongoing trade arrangements. They might plunder a monastery, but then maintain a trading relationship with its wider community. After Lindisfarne, subsequent raids followed patterns: sudden strikes at vulnerable, wealthy locations, strategic acquisition of people with skills, and rapid withdrawal to shipborne safety. These were military logics, not religious crusades. And then the pragmatics. The raid enriched certain hands. Captives were not merely trophies, but labor power and human capital. A scribe could be forced to produce documents useful to his captors. A metalworker could be compelled to reforge a sword. The loss to the monastery was not only material, but intellectual. Manuscripts, liturgical books, and written records are portable resources of administration. That means a monastery's loss could be another polity's gain in administration and literacy. The transfer of expertise is invisible in a chronicle framed for moral outrage, but it's seismic for the practical functioning of medieval polities. The immediate political consequences were equally consequential. Panic spread through coastal communities, and rulers who promised protection could bargain for centralized military structures. The existence of a mobile, maritime force that could strike without pre-existing feudal obligation created political opportunities. Kings could centralize defense in exchange for taxes. Bishops could demand fortifications and donations. Local lords could negotiate for garrisons. In short, the raids catalyzed the architecture of power that historians sometimes treat as inevitable. The violence produced the circumstances for institutional consolidation, exactly the outcome clerics and monarchs desired when they told apprentice chroniclers to accentuate terror. Yet even as institutions consolidated, a subtler transformation unfolded. Some Norse actors shifted from raiding to ruling, from plunder to urban development. Think about Dublin and York. Both started as nodes where raiders overwintered and then grew into hubs of commerce and administration. That transition required skills: governance, conflict mediation, coinage, law. The move from temporary plunder to permanent settlement was not a sudden reformation of character. It was adaptive entrepreneurship. This sequence matters because it reframes Lindisfarne. It was not a primal scream announcing the descent of an alien horde. It was a catalyst in a field of choices. Local elites could band together, or they could fall apart. They could demand centralized protection, or they could negotiate with new players. The narrative that simplifies Lindisfarne into a sudden fall of civilization is a choice to ignore the contingency and the agency of many actors who were not merely victims, but decision-makers. There are costs, always. Those captured and killed at Lindisfarne were real people, and the monastery's spiritual and social role in its community cannot be overstated. but understanding the raid as a strategic political economic act, not as a metaphysical invasion of barbarism, opens the machinery that would then be turned on the memory of Lindisfarne is where the story goes next, and it's a machine with long arms. If Lindisfarne supplied the raw moment, the shock that focused attention, then the church and allied powers supplied the polishing wheel. It is one thing for violence to occur. It is another for meaning to be attached, packaged, and sold. That is the anatomy of propaganda. Select, amplify, repeat. The first tool was language. Monastic scribes were not neutral reporters. They were pedagogues. They needed to teach, to exhort, to warn. So when a raid occurred, they reached for familiar tropes. Biblical catastrophes, heavenly punishment, satanic others. A violent entry became a prophecy fulfilled. Losses were quantified in apocalypse speak. Countless slain, the rivers turned to blood. This language did more than describe. It prescribed a moral universe. The intended effect was obvious. If the laity is taught to read raids as divine judgment, then the clergy becomes the interpreter of salvation, and the interpreter of salvation becomes the center of authority. Visuals did the rest. Manuscript marginalia and illuminated pages began to show the Northmen as distorted, sometimes horned, sometimes bestial. Those grotesques are not neutral anthropology. They are rhetorical images meant to mark difference as depravity. Over time, small artistic choices aggregate into a cultural shorthand. Foreign equals demon. Opera and theatrical spectacle centuries later would graft horns onto helmets and then hand the image back to the masses as history. That is how a 19th century costume choice becomes medieval archaeology in the public imagination. Institutional incentives fed the narrative machine. When monasteries begged for wall-building funds, their letters emphasized terror. When bishops sought royal troops, homilies framed the world as under siege. When kings sought tax centralization, chroniclers wrote of disorder needing remedy. Each actor had a motive. The repeated chorus of moral panic served the same functions: justification of resources, reinforcement of hierarchy, and simplification for broad audiences. Notice how the same structural narrative invader, victim, savior recurs in later nation-building myths. It is a pattern, not a unique event. Editing the record followed. Chronicles, copied and recopied, accumulated layers of rhetorical accretion. A monastery's contemporary annal might read like a ledger. Decades later, scribes padded it with sermonic commentary and biblical citation. Over centuries, the original, prosaic lines "boats arrived at dawn" eroded into the heathen hordes descended. The transformation is incremental and largely invisible to generations who only see copies. That process is the historian's nightmare, lost by repetition. It is also propaganda's triumph. But there are deliberate erasures as well as accretions. Consider silence. Which events are recorded and which are not? A violent campaign by a Christian king could be reframed as righteous conquest. The chronicler who benefited from royal patronage would have reasons to minimize or justify deeds like mass executions. Here is a blunt rule: moral outrage is selective. The medieval textual landscape is full of deletions, omissions, and redactions that make the other uniquely monstrous while forgiving allies. That asymmetry is evidence of agency. It is also how reputations are manufactured. Fast forward a few centuries. The newly Christianized Scandinavian courts begin their own rewriting. Former raiders, now rulers, have a stake in sanitizing lineage. They recast violent episodes as testing and redemption conversion narratives that emphasize continuity and legitimacy. Local elites in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden patronized histories portraying conversion as civilizational progress. In that domestic retelling, the Viking past was tamed. It became prelude, not indictment. Both Christian and Scandinavian authors thus participated in a bipolar rewriting. Demonize, then domesticize, depending on context. The memory became malleable to politics on both sides. Enter Romantic nationalism. 19th century intellectuals and poets pick these bones and refashion them into ancestry for modern nations. The Viking becomes heroic progenitor or cautionary tale, depending on political flavor. In Germany and Norway, the idealized Viking justified imagined racial or national continuity. In France and England, the Viking past could be used to moralize about the triumph of Christianity or, inversely, to celebrate a primordial vigor. These are not neutral rewrites. They are the invention of origin myths. The 19th century search for roots grabbed medieval scraps and turned them into foundational legislation for identity. Finally, modern mass culture sealed the myth. Cinema, television, and gaming favor spectacle. A violent Viking, screaming and painted with anachronistic horns, is visually immediate and convenient. Scripts and budgets prefer one archetype, the marauder. Nuance makes for harder cuts and more expensive exposition. So the composite image horned helmet, war cry, bloodlust becomes the commodity fed back to global audiences. Museums and tourism, too, anthropomorphize heritage into marketable tableaus. Festivals, souvenirs, branded experiences teach visitors to consume simplified narratives. Economics thus reinforces the myth. It is worth pausing on mechanisms. Propaganda succeeds because it relies on a small set of operations. Amplification, repeat the alarming bits. Omission, silence the inconvenient facts. Characterization, attach moral descriptors. And ritualization, turn event into lesson. Combined, these techniques change the field of what is thinkable. They transform an episodic political struggle into an epical moral drama. That shift is the real conquest. It's not territory alone. It is the colonization of memory. And yet the archaeological and textual counters persist. Coins, ship remains, law codes, burial inventories, the material record quietly resists the narrative. When a horde of Abbasid dirhams surfaces in Gotland or a ship construction trench reveals intricate carpentry, the truth leaks out of the propagandistic net. The evidence does not dispute violence. It complicates it. It offers alternate explanations for motivation, scope, and consequence. Slow, fragmented, but accumulative, the material voice pushes back against rhetorical monologues. There is one final and modern twist. The myth now feeds contemporary politics in ways the medieval propagandists could not have imagined. Movements invoke the Viking as either ancestral pride or specter of invasion. Both uses are selective. The Viking as symbol of strength can become a dog whistle for exclusion in the modern era. The Viking as villain can be repurposed to justify defensive militarism. The image is a cultural tool, quick to hand, easily exploited. That is a living legacy of medieval propaganda. Once a symbol is forged, it can be repurposed ad infinitum. Understanding the machine is not merely academic. It is a caution. When history is simplified into a narrative that serves institutions, whether medieval monasteries or modern nation-states, it ceases to be a tool for understanding and becomes an instrument for control. The demonic Viking, the noble savage, the heroic ancestor, each is less an accurate portrait than a mirror that shows the needs and anxieties of the people looking into it. So what remains after we strip away the rhetoric? A complex mosaic. Violent episodes executed with economic goals, adaptive settlers who built towns, legal innovations admired by neighbors, and a memory that has been remade to suit every storyteller who touched it. The propaganda machine did its work well. The job now is not to deny violence, but to recover proportion. To know the Norse is to hold together contradictory truths. They were traders and raiders, lawmakers and slavers, innovators and assimilators. Propaganda gave us monsters for a purpose. Archaeology and careful reading give us humans for reasons that make us a little less comfortable and a lot better informed. There is more to unpick. specific images, sermons, royal decrees, and 19th-century plays that until now have conspired to lock the Viking into a single shape. We will trace them, scene by scene, to see how that autonomy shaped social choices at every level, from family farms to the composition of expeditions. It made the Viking world flexible in ways that later chroniclers found embarrassing and therefore useful to misdescribe. Their political architecture was built around the thing. Assemblies where disputes were aired, fines fixed, alliances forged. The thing was not the same as modern democracy, but it mattered. Local elites were checked by public procedure. Law had an element of consensus. Imagine a sunlit hill slope near a river, men and women squinting in the wind as a dispute about fences or oaths is settled by speech and ritual. That routine governance stands in direct contrast with the feudal absolutisms that would later claim moral superiority. And it is precisely that contrast that helps explain why the Norse were painted as disorderly. The label served to justify the imposition of different political orders. Their technology deserves theatrical emphasis because it literally reconceived distance. The longship is not just a weapon. It is an infrastructure, a loafing prow, and a craft of light drafts that hugged coasts and slipped up rivers. To see a reconstructed hull hauled from the mud in a modern museum is to see the difference between a society that is constrained by terrain and one that deliberately reconfigures it. Their naval craft turned the North Sea, the Baltic, and the rivers of Eastern Europe into highways. That mobility was infrastructure for commerce, intelligence gathering, and yes, military action. Trade was not peripheral, it was central. Hordes of dirhams from the Abbasid world in Gotland, Islamic silver circulating in Norwegian burials, Frankish goods in Dublin. These are not trophies, they are the accounting of networks. Where medieval textbooks show a sudden eruption of violence, the material record shows follow-through, exchange nodes that became towns. Think of York, once a military overwintering site that invested in infrastructure, minted coin, and hosted an emergent civic life. The same hands that seized treasure could also set up portside stalls the next season. Violence and commerce were braided strategies. This practical hybridity extended to human capital. Skilled captives were appliances of state building. A scribe taken from a monastery could be repurposed to keep accounts, to write legal documents, to administer newly acquired land. An artisan could reforge swords not just for raiding, but for trade. When a monastery lost a codex, the code of administration it contained might surface in an unexpected place in the north, transmuted into capability. That transfer is a major, underemphasized engine of medieval change. Talent moves as well as treasure. Culture and conversion were equally pragmatic. Many Norse who settled in foreign lands adopted local ways because it simplified governance and increased profit. In Normandy, within a generation, the language and law shifted. In Ireland and England, Norse settlers blended with local communities and their children inherited hybrid identities. Conversion to Christianity, where it occurred, was seldom an immediate moral capitulation. More often it was a political and economic decision that opened doors and stabilized rule. Yet honesty demands admitting the darker currents. Vikings engaged in raiding that could be brutal. Sites reveal burned layers, and chronicles record atrocities. But context matters. Some attacks were targeted strikes on wealthy, poorly defended centers' operations with clear economic logic. Others were escalatory responses to local politics, supply pressures, or revenge. To call these acts simply savage is to flatten motive and outcome into moral caricature. The truth is messier, strategies that combine negotiation, violence, and settlement. Finally, the Norse left durable institutions, towns that became nodes of long-distance trade, legal mechanisms that informed later parliamentary practice, innovations in shipbuilding that rewired the map. Their legacy is not one of simple barbarism followed by assimilation. It is a story of iterative adaptation: raid, trade, settle, govern. The uncomfortable conclusion is that the Norse threatened not only bodies and monasteries, but models of domination. They proposed through practice, not pamphlet, an alternate order that prized mobility, consensus, and economic fluidity. That is the real reason narratives hardened against them. You learn the Viking as a flat villain. Look now at the textures, the ledger, the longship's keel, the runic inscription on a grave marker. Each complicates a myth. And if those complications unsettle you, bear in mind that what follows is the machinery that polished the myth and why it was so eager to hide the complexity you've just begun to see. The myth did not merely arrive. It was manufactured and delivered in layers, each layer smoothing away inconvenient details. To understand the modern Viking image is to follow a conveyor belt. Medieval sermonizers, chroniclers, royal chancelleries, later scholars, romantic poets, and, finally, mass entertainment. Each stage recycled and amplified the previous distortions until the original traces were nearly obscured. Begin in the scriptoria. Monastic scribes were not neutral reporters. They were litigators with ink. When Lindisfarne burned, a scribe's first impulse was theological meaning. A violent event demanded a moral grammar. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Continental Annals use apocalyptic language because apocalyptic sells penitence and resources. Those metaphors do work. They move parishioners. They justify taxation for fortifications. They legitimize appeals to kingship. Imagine a monk shaping a line. The heathen roamed like locusts, rhetorical choices that would stick. When you read those lines centuries later, you hear a sermon as much as a report. Visual culture amplified the message. Illumination and marginalia began to depict the Northmen with grotesque features, horns that later operas would literally exaggerate. Those images performed a simple job: make the other less human. Visual shorthand is swift and enduring, a grotesque margin drawing in a book that circulates through monasteries functions like a logo. Repeating that logo in sermons and liturgical calendars reinforced its power. Visual othering shapes effect before reason intervenes. Political actors found the narrative convenient. A king who promised protection against sea robbers could centralize levy power. Bishops who insisted on higher tithes to fund walls benefited. Consider how the demand for fortifications and military retinues fed fiscal centralization. The panic was monetizable. The narrative of chaos, foreign, violent, godless, justified consolidation. It is plausible, even likely, that some local elites quietly encouraged fear because fear translated to support and resources. That potential complicity is a recurring theme. Propaganda often serves interests that are not obvious at first glance. The machine also edited archives. Chronicles are copied by hand. Each scribe is an editor. Over decades and centuries, neutral entries became padded with rhetoric. Dates were linked to biblical typology, and local grievances were framed as moral catastrophe. Historians call this accretion. The result is that what survives most often is the amplified version. Where contemporary, mundane records vanish, the sensational survives. It is a preservation bias that favors drama. Then came the rewrite from the north. Once Scandinavian polities converted and consolidated, their own elites had reasons to domesticize the Viking past. Rather than endorse a forever barbaric ancestry, they recast violent episodes as rites of passage, as testing that led to redemption and Christian kingship. That rewrite tamed the Viking image internally. Two parallel narratives took shape: demonization abroad, domestication at home. Both served power, one to exclude, the other to legitimize. The 19th century completed the alchemy. Romantic nationalism needed founding myths. Poets and philologists reached back and borrowed selectively. The Viking became a primordial root noble in some nationalist projects, fearsome in others. The 19th century imagination painted horned helmets and noble savagery, an aesthetic that filmmakers and novelists later borrowed. These modern appropriations were aesthetic and ideological, not scholarly. They were convenient icons for industrial projects of pop culture appropriates the image for aesthetics, often without historic nuance. The same image can be a source of pride, a dog whistle for exclusion, or a simple entertainment motif. The point is not to sanitize past brutality. It is to recognize that the myth has a purpose beyond simple history. If propaganda turned a competitor into a demon, archaeology and careful reading slowly reconstruct a human being. Trader, sailor, lawmaker, settler, raider. The reward of that reconstruction is not nostalgia, it is clarity. The cost is discomfort. Once you stop seeing Vikings as one-dimensional villains, you must also admit that institutions, churches, states, markets manufacture histories to protect themselves. That realization is the true legacy. History is not only about the past. It is about the present powers that shape the past for their needs. And if you think this is a settled, purely academic debate, wait. The next layer waits in plain sight. The ways this manufactured memory plays out in our politics and daily imaginings. The scene to come is less about the past and more about how we let the past be used. That is where the real stakes are. The episode ends with a simple, unsettling question. If a near contemporary people like the Norse whose traces are abundant, whose coins cross continents, whose ships lay buried in mud can be reduced to a cartoon by 1,000 small edits of language and image, how many other peoples have been flattened by the same machine? You have watched a system at work: event, interpretation, institutional interest, visual shorthand, cultural reproduction. The mechanism repeats. The true task of historical curiosity is not to rescue every past from moral judgment, but to insist on proportion, to ask who benefits from the version presented, and to look for the voices and traces that were left out. If this investigation mattered to you, stay with it. Subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments. Where did you first learn the Viking story? And help open the next dossier. There are more myths waiting to be unstitched, and each one will change a little of how you see the present.